Okay, so welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this evening for this first webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting tonight. And for me, that's the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This evening's webinar is the first of two that we're presenting for the Good Sports Clubs. And they will provide a comprehensive toolkit to help you with recruiting and retaining volunteers for your club into the future. We are recording this webinar tonight and we'll be making it available on the website together with a companion toolkit in the next few days. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started and I hand over to Hazel. Your microphones need to be on mute, so that makes sure that there's no interruptions within the recording. It's also might be better for you if you turn your video off as well. It might be easier for you if the video, if you don't have your video on, it's less distracting and we can focus on the slides. If you have some questions, there is a chat feature within Zoom. So if you would post your questions there, then we can get to as many of them as possible at the end of the session. So I will ask Hazel those on your behalf. So this evening's webinar will focus on recruiting volunteers and it will cover volunteer administration, what do good sports clubs need to have in place. It'll cover recruitment strategies, how to attract volunteers, and Hazel will also take us through some case studies as well. So our presenter tonight is Hazel Maynard, who is a trainer and she works also in the sector development area at Volunteering Victoria. Over the past 3 decades, Hazel has worked in the not-for-profit sector for organisations such as the Australian Red Cross, Amnesty International and the Cancer Council Victoria. She has managed large and small volunteer programs and she's a trainer for Volunteering Victoria. She's passionate about encouraging people who are socially isolated or marginalised to volunteer and also for upholding the rights of volunteers. She became a board member of Volunteering Victoria in 2006 and was the president of the Board of Management from 2008 to 2010. Hazel was awarded an honorary life membership of the national peak body Volunteering Australia in 2006 and she's had several articles published. In 2017, Hazel was given a Volunteering Victoria Lifetime Achievement Award, which is for long-standing, distinguished and meritorious services to the volunteering sector in a leadership role. So now I'd like to hand over to you, Hazel, to take us through the session tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And good evening, everyone, and it might be good afternoon where some of you are. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm working this evening. I'm in Casey in southeast Melbourne, and it's the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here this evening. So, attracting volunteers. I'd just like to check everyone's in the right place for the right topic, because it's not unknown for us to start doing a webinar and someone will pipe up that this is not Tai Chi for beginners or embroidery for advanced classes. So long as we're all here for attracting volunteers, we're in the right place. Let's make sure this thing works. So Volunteering Victoria is a state peak body. So what that means is we represent the interests of volunteers, volunteer engaging organisations and the people who lead and manage volunteer programs, whether they are paid or unpaid. And there's an equivalent state peak in each state and territory in Australia. So I'll just move on to the next slide. It's lovely to welcome you from every state and territory in Australia. Some of you have freedoms that we in Melbourne can only dream about, like having a haircut, which is why I've put Cousin It up there because I'm starting to look like Cousin It. It's so long since I've had my hair cut. We have a collection of small and large agencies and clubs represented this evening. Some are completely volunteer run and some are a mix of paid and unpaid in their teams. So we'll try and cover things that look at everyone's particular circumstances. And just to add to the background that Mary's already shared with you, I'm also very passionate about sport. I'm a cyclist and a skier when we're allowed to actually go to the ski slopes, and I'm also a passionate gym junkie, but haven't been there since March, unfortunately. Looking forward to that opening again. So as Mary said, we've got a 40-minute presentation, and then I encourage you to put some questions in the chat room and we'll address them at the end for you if we can. It's not a COVID-specific presentation. I'll be looking a little bit more at COVID next week, but given that the circumstances are so different in every state and territory in Australia, it's a little bit difficult to approach COVID at this stage. But if you do have any COVID-specific questions, please put them in the chat room and we'll try and address them for you. So today's agenda, as Mary said, we're going to be looking at administration. Whatever size club or organisation you have, everyone needs a little bit of infrastructure around there. So I'll talk you through some basics of that. We're going to talk about how we recruit volunteers. We're going to talk about how we advertise roles for volunteers, which is an area where clubs and particularly charities often go wrong in advertising. And I'm just going to share with you a couple of case studies of successful recruitment that I've done for the sporting sector. Some of you might be familiar with the fact that we actually have a definition in Australia of what a volunteer is. It's not a legally recognised definition. It wouldn't stand up in a court of law, but it was developed by the national peak body, Volunteering Australia, who are based in Canberra, in consultation with the sector. So basically, you're all volunteers if you give your time willingly for the common good and without financial gain. Some of you may have seen this before, some of you may not. So, volunteering has become a lot more regulated over the years that I've been involved, and some people might see some of those regulations as barriers to volunteering, like police checks and working with children checks and all the other sorts of things that we do safety around volunteers. I actually see them as a very positive move. It gives volunteers a status. It gives volunteers protection in their volunteer roles. So the challenge is always to find a balance, a common sense approach to engaging volunteers and managing the risk, but not scaring them away with too much red tape. And I'll talk about that right at the end of the presentation. Despite the fact that we have almost 6 million adults, 6 million people over the age of 18 volunteer in some form every year in Australia, volunteering is a largely unregulated sector. It's not regulated in each state or territory by laws in the same way as employment is. So what we use in the sector are a wonderful set of things called the national standards. So they give us an indication of how we should structure a volunteer program. They're what we call best practice. And they've been developed so that they will fit every size of organisation for large or small. And I'll share with you at the end some work I've been doing this year, as I said, with a major soccer club that's adopted the national standards to great success. If you've never seen the national standards before and you have insomnia, get yourself a copy because you'll get to page 6 and then you will be fast asleep. Like any book of standards, they're not the most interesting thing in the world, but they're the best thing that we have in the sector to guide us in working with volunteers. So just thinking about policies and procedures. Some of you may have none of these, some of you may have all of those. It's really dependent on the size of the organisation that you have. If you have a treasurer, a secretary, president, that sort of structure in your club, and someone who's responsible for record keeping, it may be their role to develop policies and procedures. They're not mandatory, however, it's worth checking that in each state or territory there may be different laws and requirements around having policies and procedures in place. For example, in Victoria, it's mandatory to share sexual harassment legislation with paid and unpaid staff. We have certain obligations under the Equal Opportunity Act. in Victoria which apply equally to paid and unpaid staff. So it's worth checking in with your peak body or with the relevant legislative authorities if any of these things need to be communicated to volunteers. And a policy and procedure doesn't have to look like War and Peace. It can be a very short document. And there's lots of information out there if you Google it, and lots of organisations like your state peaks will be willing to help you with templates for this sort of thing. Okay, in terms of the sort of documents you might need to have, again, they don't have to be lengthy. You don't need to have all of these. But ideally, you would have some of these documents and you would have a way to record volunteer details. So you might use a database, you might use Access, or you might use an Excel spreadsheet. But it's really important for insurance purposes to keep a note of who your volunteers are, when they started and when they left your organisation. And if I had to pick one from the list above, I would say that a role description is probably the most critical of those documents. Helps you recruit people according to the needs of your club or your organisation. It spells out the requirements of the role, but it's also there to protect the volunteer from being asked to do something that they weren't recruited to do. And again, it doesn't have to be a very long document. There's lots of templates out there. In Victoria, we have templates on Volunteering Victoria's website for things like that, and I'm sure your state peaks would have those as well. But a role description is a critical document, a critical instrument in the volunteer relationship with your organisation. It also means if you have someone approach you who's not able to fulfil the requirements of the role description, if they need a specific skill for what you're advertising and they don't have that skill, you can decline their application based on their capacity or their incapacity to perform that role, rather than base it on, you know, a personal issue. So I'd like to draw your attention to thinking about why people volunteer. Most people have different reasons for volunteering. If you think about the breadth of volunteering across this country, there are 1,000 different reasons. Thinking about your own motivation for why you volunteer as well. You may be looking to recruit volunteers for a specific event. You may be recruiting them for an ongoing position. So it's really important to find out why a person has come to your organisation and why they're there, why they're continuing with what they do. I take part through the year in cycling events, and I'm quite happy to get up in the middle of the night and drive there, and, you know, being Melbourne, quite often cycle in the rain, and I look at the volunteers along the course standing there with their umbrellas, you know, 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning in the pouring rain, and I often think, why do you do this? And I appreciate every single one of them along the way and say thank you to them. But I'm always surprised at how few people don't even notice that the volunteers are there. But I would be interested to stop and ask each one of them why you're actually here today. What makes you want to come and volunteer and stand in the rain at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning? But I'm eternally grateful to them that they do. So it's worth thinking about why people volunteer. And quite often it's passion for the sport that they're part of that's driven them to that. Something that's again often overlooked in the recruitment process is thinking about the benefits of volunteering and sharing those with people who may be potential volunteers. Research tells us that volunteering or doing something altruistic gives you a hit of all those feel-good hormones like the runners get, the runners high. And research also shows that particularly in people over the age of 65 who volunteer, they enjoy better physical and mental health than their non-volunteering counterparts. So that's also worth emphasising, I think, in some quarters. But, you know, at the bottom line, one of the best benefits of volunteering is it makes you feel great, physically and mentally. It's a real boost to what you do. So it's worth, I think, sometimes when we're recruiting to actually focus on the benefits of volunteering as well as what we're asking for from people coming to our organisations. So I'm just going to talk you through a little plan, the steps to successful volunteer recruitment. If you think about the difference between paid and unpaid work, when we look for a new paid role, there's often a push factor involved. So in other words, the job that you have is not fulfilling your needs for some particular reason, so you are pushed into looking for something else. That doesn't exist in a volunteer context. It's all about the pull. So there's no push, it's a pull relationship. So you are trying to recruit people based on a perspective of hearts and minds rather than economic realities and economic necessities. So that's why I emphasise sometimes the benefits of volunteering. So the starting point is to think about, if you're going to develop a recruitment plan, think about why you need volunteers and why they will be attracted to your organisation. Then you need to think about what you're going to ask them to do, and that's where you develop a brief role description. That might determine if you have a particular target group. So if you develop a role that requires particular skills, are you going to target a particular group of people to fulfill those requirements? Or are you going to cast your net wide and see who turns up? Then you're going to have to think about how you're going to reach them, what types of media you will use, and I'll just get to that in a minute and cover that. And the logistics of it, where and when they are going to volunteer. So having a very clear recruitment plan, again, it doesn't have to be complicated, but it's a great thing to develop in writing before you start rushing out and recruiting people. And then you think, well, actually, what are we going to do with them now? And what forms are we going to get them to fill in? So planning in advance is the best strategy, I think. Okay, this is an activity that I would normally do if I do a recruitment workshop, which is usually 3 hours. It's a really good idea to think about why people would come to your particular organisation, as opposed to why they would volunteer in general. What is it that makes you special that will make them want to come to you? So if you think about the difference between paid and unpaid employment, quite often if you're looking for a paid job, you might be an engineer, you would look under engineering online, or in, as we used to in the old days, look in the newspaper, but online. And then you might see a role and you think, oh, they'd be a great organisation to work for. With volunteering, it's often the opposite. And the sort of organisations I worked for, like Amnesty International, the sort of people who are attracted to that type of organisation look at the organisation first because they identify with the values of the organisation, and then they would look at the role second. And it would be the same, I would say, in attracting volunteers to a sporting club. They're attracted to what you do, what your brand is, if you want to call it that, and then they may look at what the role is. So it's worth thinking about, if there's a group of you together, actually do this exercise so you understand why people volunteer for your organisation. And a great starting point for that is asking existing volunteers why they came to you in the first place. So when you've developed all of that, you need to make yourself a catchy ad. You think that's a catchy ad? Possibly not, but it obviously worked because he did get some volunteers there somewhere. So what you need to do, I would say, the best thing to have is a short ad. A lot of organisations and clubs make a mistake of having something that's really long and really dull and lacks that pulling power that you need to bring people. So an attention-grabbing headline. And what I mean by that is not something that says we are desperate for volunteers. No one's going to read to the second part of anything that starts with the word desperate. So the starting point is writing a catchy headline to get people to read to the next bit. And I'll give you a wonderful example of that. Our local council bought a minibus to drive around people to seniors clubs, and they put an ad in the local paper and on the website that said, we need volunteers to drive around elderly citizens, something along those lines, and they got no applications. So they rewrote the headline with some help, and we turned that into, would you like to drive our Mercedes? Because it was a Mercedes minibus, and we got lots of applicants for that particular role. So in a catchy ad, you need 5 things. The headline, you need who you are, what your organisation is. We are a sports club, we are whatever. what the role is, very briefly, what's in it for the volunteer. Okay, what are they going to get out of it, and how to make it happen? How can they contact you to express their interest in that? That may be a link to a role description, it may be an email address, it may be a phone number, but it does not have to be complicated. But the really important thing is to have a headline that catches people's attention. So it's usually a call to action, come and help us do this, or a question, would you like to? And my local council put this on the website, and this is a great ad. This is for an event that was held last year or even the year before. Come and meet the stars. So that's an interesting headline, so people will read down to the next bit. It just tells you who they are, what the event is, what they want people to do, and how to make it happen, and the time commitment. And they got lots of interest in that particular ad. By the way, I'll share this PowerPoint with Mary so that you have access to all of this in case you're busy trying to scribble it all down now. You'll be able to have the PowerPoint after the session's finished. So I think that's a really good ad, very succinct, not too wordy, tells you what you need to know, tells you enough, but it doesn't drown you in detail. Okay, recruitment strategies. We're going to talk about, some people think that you should recruit according to age demographic. So they say, if you want to reach baby boomers, use this. If you want to reach millennials, use this. I'm not a fan of pigeonholing or stereotyping people. I think that excludes large percentages of the community if we do that. So you can either make a decision to narrow down the type of media that you use, or you can cast your net wide. And these are just some of the suggestions that I've used in the past. So obviously social media is a big one, word of mouth, newsletters, you know, local markets we have all across Australia. One of the things that's often forgotten is local radio stations. They're usually very willing to help local community groups, and they're certainly a very willing participant that I found in Victoria in volunteer recruitment. A lot of councils have websites where you can advertise for volunteers. You have existing volunteers, supporters and donors. There's also a national website called Go Volunteer, which is free for you to use. And something I found quite effective in the past is putting a profile of an existing volunteer on your website with their own particular story of how they came to be a volunteer for your club or organisation and why they stay there. So that's a good story. But if we had to pick one out of those to say which was the most effective way of recruiting volunteers, despite the fact we all have social media these days, ABS shows us that 64% of people still become involved in volunteering because they were asked or through someone they know that volunteers there. It's a very powerful strategy, and I think perhaps you know, we don't necessarily make enough of our existing volunteers to recruit new volunteers. It's surprising considering that the focus that we have on social media these days, that it's still word of mouth. Although I guess in this day and age, you could also think of Facebook as a word of mouth. Now, I'm just going to touch a little bit on some of the barriers to volunteering. I'm not a fan of the word barrier. I think if we call something a barrier, it becomes that. But we often hear about things that put people off from volunteering. One of those things is the perceived regulatory barriers in this day and age, screening, you know, police checks, all those sort of things. And again, I'll come to that in just a minute. A lot of people are very unwilling to make a long-term commitment. So it's worth considering whether the roles that you have could be turned into project-based roles. One of the issues that we have here in Victoria is in that June, July and August, all our volunteers go to Queensland normally in a normal year. So every not-for-profit in Victoria runs out of volunteers in winter because they're chasing the sunshine. So some people have to structure their programs around that. Sometimes socio-economic disadvantage is a barrier to volunteering. So it costs people to volunteer. You may be in a position to offer people transport reimbursement if that's an issue for them, but that's also worth thinking about in your recruitment strategy. A great percentage of the population don't know how to get involved. I speak to people all the time who have nothing to do with volunteering. It's never been part of their lives. And they say the only thing that stopped me is I didn't know where to start. I didn't know who to ask. So I think as a sector, we have a lot of work to do in getting that message across about how to get involved. No one asked me is a very common response that we get, and a fear of rejection. It's actually quite a brave thing to put yourself out there and offer your services to an organisation or a club. And if you think of the epidemic of loneliness that we have across the community and the high number of people with a depressive illness, to make a move to approach someone and ask about volunteering is a very brave thing to do, a very bold thing, I reckon. So actually asking people and being proactive in your recruitment strategies is better than hoping that people will come to you. And the last one I've put in, because what's happened during COVID is what we call formal and informal volunteering has come to the fore. Formal volunteering is when there's a third party involved, so a club or a charity or a local council. Informal volunteering is where people just mobilise themselves in their own communities, as we've seen across the country in COVID, and they're making food packages for their neighbours, they're helping people. So what's happening is a lot of people are doing this on a very informal basis, but they don't understand that if they want to carry on with volunteering in a certain way, it becomes a formal relationship, and that's where the form filling and the screening and all those sorts of things come in to play. We're hoping that this huge wave of interest in informal volunteering that's been happening over the last 6 months will continue into formal volunteering. I think we need to do some work to capture those people. I'm just going to touch briefly on screening, because this is a relatively new development in volunteer engagement. 10 years ago, we didn't talk about police checking volunteers, and certainly working with children checks are a very recent requirement. And it's often a part that people see as challenging, and quite often it's not managed particularly well. It does not have to put people off volunteering, and I see it as a safeguard rather than a barrier to volunteering. It's to make sure that everyone's safe, and obviously working with children checks are a legal requirement in many organisations, so they're not something that's an option, they're part of mandatory screening. So in terms of working with volunteers, volunteer screening can involve a number of different things. Obviously your role description, because that helps screen out people who are unsuitable. You may, yep, got to the end of that list there. You may do a formal interview, you may not do interviews in your clubs. You may do reference checks, qualification or license check. If you are engaging a volunteer to provide first aid, you need to check they've got the relevant qualifications for something like that. If you're engaging a volunteer who's going to be responsible for driving a vehicle or a piece of equipment that you have, again, you'll need to check up on that. Criminal history checks are an interesting one. I think, you know, in another 5 years, people won't see those as a barrier to volunteering, because they're becoming much more broadly accepted across the community. But what I see a lot of is organisations make a decision, a policy decision, to have police checks in place, but they don't have a procedure for declining people who may return a positive criminal history. And that's always a likelihood. If you run a police check with enough people, someone is going to come back with something that may be of concern to you. I have a friend who's a lawyer, and his take on that is 50% of the population has a criminal history and the rest of us haven't been caught yet, which is somewhat cynical, but the chances are if you run enough police checks, you're going to turn up some that are of concern to you. So if you have a policy of running police checks, there also needs to be some sort of inclusion in there about what course of action you'll take if a person has a criminal history and how we handle that. The role of police checks is not to embarrass people, it's not to judge people, it's a risk management exercise and nothing more. We are assessing the risk of that person being part of your club or organisation based on their history, nothing else. Working with children checks, and the difference is with a criminal history check, you make the decision on whether the person is suitable. Working with children checks, someone else makes that decision on your behalf. So if a person doesn't isn't granted to working with children yet, you don't need to make a decision on that because they will not be part of your organisation. Okay, I'm hoping you're putting lots of questions in the chat room as we talk. Some good chat room, Mary, people, are we getting stuff in there?
No, we don't actually have any yet, so
okay, all right.
Don't hesitate to add some.
Okay, well, we can turn the sound on and ask questions if people would prefer to do that. Not everyone's comfortable with the chat room. So I'm just going to share with you a couple of case studies. As I said, I've been volunteering remotely for the Western United Football Club, and I have to say soccer is not one of my passions in terms of sports. I don't think if they offered me a free ticket to a match I would turn up. However, I've been helping them with their policies and procedures. So what happened was the club got up and running. They had lots of supporters who wanted to assist with various things, so they didn't necessarily call them volunteers, but it just hit them at some point in time that they needed to do something and provide some infrastructure around having multiple people come onto their grounds and be part of their organisation as volunteers. So they came to some training that was offered by their local council in Werribee, and I did a presentation on the national standards. And we looked at the national standards, and it was a really a pioneering exercise because we hadn't looked at them before in relation to a major sporting club. So we looked at the bits of the standards that would help them, like developing role descriptions, looking at things like orientation checklists for new volunteers, safety instructions, and safety checklists for each of the tasks that they have available to volunteers. And we also looked at developing a recruitment strategy and sort of advertising material that would appeal to people who already supported the club as fans, but also people who were in the community but not necessarily had thought about becoming a volunteer. So it's been a really, really successful venture with them. And they're always very happy to answer questions and be contacted by people. So if any of you are interested in talking to Western United Football Club to see what their story has been so far, they're a great group of people and always very happy to share. So a real success story. So they have they've developed a wonderful volunteer program. They've spent this time during COVID, obviously with their team being somewhere else, to make sure that all the safeguards are in place, but it hasn't put people off by having the infrastructure around the club. It's been quite a lot of work for them to do, but I think they're certainly very happy with the outcome. At the other end of the spectrum in terms of scale, I used to be a member of a running and triathlon club when I was a much younger, fitter person, and we decided that we needed to recruit volunteers who would help us run events. We ran small events all around, it was in Brisbane at the time. So we recruited a volunteer who was the partner of a member, was a non-running partner of a member, and she set up volunteer records, so she was able to contact people in advance and let them know when we had an event coming up and what particular role they would play. So it was very, very structured for such a small club. It was great. So we had advertising material and role descriptions for the specific roles in events, like a baggage temp volunteer, route marshals, all those sorts of things. And we had a safety plan and an OH&S checklist that everyone was given on the day. There was a safety briefing prior to each event. And this is pre-Google days, pre-internet days, so we would probably do most of this stuff online, I reckon, these days. But, you know, it was a manual checklist back then, in the last century, before we had access to the internet so broadly. And we also attended other events to distribute recruitment materials. So we would go to large triathlons and other sporting events around Brisbane and recruit events volunteers. And people who are often not able to make a commitment to an ongoing volunteer role will quite happily come on board and help with a specific event. So again, that was a really good, successful exercise, but it was quite well structured and people felt very well supported through that. So just to summarise my next slide, this is what I call my top tips I've put down there for you. You know, can you make your club or your event family friendly? Can you offer childcare if it's an event? There's ways of thinking about making things family friendly and family safe as well. And again, when you're recruiting volunteers, particularly for the area of sports, you're tapping into their passions and interests, and that needs to be reflected in your advertising material. We talked extensively, I think, about police checks, and, you know, think about streamlining the red tape. If we call things barriers, if someone comes to us and says they want to volunteer and we go, oh, well, there's lots of hoops to jump through and there's barriers there, instantly the language you use around those is going to turn people off. But if we tell them part of the process is going through this, and we make it a positive experience, then it won't be a barrier. We talked at the beginning about registering volunteers and keeping accurate records, thinking about some sort of induction, safety briefings. It's on everyone's mind in this day and age. Meaningful roles. I think there's a volunteering role out there for everybody. I like to think along the lines of inclusive volunteering, so people from different community backgrounds, people with different disability, you know, people who have something to offer regardless of their own situation. And it's about finding something that will give them a meaningful role at a level that is appropriate for their skills and abilities. Thinking about how they can contact their supervisor or support person. Something I've often heard in the past in my work with volunteers is I don't know who my supervisor is. I've been put in this team, but if I have an issue, it's not clear to me who I should go to for support. So that's just a little pointer I put down there. And next week, we're going to be talking about volunteer retention and recognition. So we'll cover this a little bit more, but people like to know what the outcome of their work is. How did they help achieve whatever it is you have achieved? So thinking about that. And again, next week, we're going to talk about being creative in maintaining contact. So I'll just leave you with this thought. We always say there are 4 main areas of volunteering across the Australian community: welfare and community sector, religious organisations, education and training, and by far the largest is sport and recreation. People who volunteer in sport and recreation work more hours, volunteer more hours than any other sector. And during National Volunteer Week, we have in May each year, I do presentations to volunteers and to different groups of people, different councils, organisations, and I always pose the question, if all the volunteers in this country went on strike on the same day, how long do you think it would be till we started to feel the effects of that? It's not a suggestion, by the way, it's just a question that I often ask. And I think the impact would be instant. So not only would sport cease at every level, we'd have no Meals on Wheels, okay, we'd have no community transport. It wouldn't just be the big picture stuff that would be affected, it would be those individual actions and services that we provide to people in our community. So never underestimate how important you are. Never ever say, I'm just a volunteer. There is no such thing in this country. Volunteers make this country what it is. So if you are flexible enough to pat yourself on the back, please do so, because without you, there would be no sport in any level in this country. And we're too busy volunteering ever to think about the impact of what we do, no doubt. So, questions? Does anyone have any questions?
There's nothing on the chat, but
Okay.
I did have one that I had thought of. In the more formal setting, is there a cap on the number of hours that a volunteer can work? When does it where's that blurry line between when they should really be a paid staff member and they're no longer really a volunteer?
That's a good question, Mary. The benchmark, there is no legal requirement. I mean, there is absolutely nothing in writing. So certainly I've never come across that says, if it's more than X number of hours, it should be a paid role. So there's a couple of benchmarks I use for that. 15 hours is generally the maximum I would ever recruit someone for in a volunteer role. And the other benchmark is particularly, not so much in a sporting club, but in a traditional not-for-profit setting, I always look at the consequences of that job ceasing. So if you put a volunteer in a pivotal role and the volunteer suddenly stopped coming, what would the consequences be of that withdrawal? So if that would be catastrophic, then you perhaps wouldn't put a volunteer in that role, because having a contract of employment means that that probably wouldn't happen. But I would say the benchmark generally accepted across the sector is around about 15 hours.
Yeah.
But I know organisations where volunteers work 4 days a week because it's their personal choice.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Peter Willoughby has a question. Did you want to ask that now, Peter?
Yeah, I do. Hi, Hazel.
Peter?
I'm the secretary of a disability football club, and our biggest problem is finding the volunteers. At the moment, there's only three that run the club. So myself, our treasurer, and our president. Being a disability sport, a lot of the people come from DHS houses and stuff like that. So they don't have their parents and that around. Is there a way that we could put something on the Volunteer Victoria website?
Are you in Victoria?
Yes, we are. We're in Chadstone, so we're in the city of Monash.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Go volunteer is what we use to advertise.
Okay.
Have you ever thought about? Do you know what corporate volunteering is?
No.
Okay. Corporate volunteering is where organisations pay, if you like, their employees, or allow their employees to come and do volunteering on a regular basis. And sometimes it can be regular, sometimes it can just be 3 days a year. But there are lots of organisations that encourage their staff, their employees, to have an association with a not-for-profit organisation on a long-term basis. Like the first one that springs to mind is the RACV. In Victoria, they have an association with a couple of environmental groups, so their staff volunteer on a regular basis. So, Peter, when you get this slide presentation through Mary, my email address is on the front. Yep. If you'd like to email me, you and I can have a one-on-one offline, and I can help you come up with some ideas. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Thank you very much.
Happy to do that all the time. So we'll do that. We'll see what we can do for you.
Cool. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Does anybody else have another question at all?
Mick Hill here.
Hi, how you going?
Good, thanks. The new start that for over 55s that in Victoria's, I think it's $14,000 for volunteers if they meet the criteria and they work 15 hours in clubs. Do you know much about that?
No, I'm a little bit out of the loop on that because I don't work in volunteer management anymore. I used to when I was working for a not-for-profit. It was a big part of my job, but I don't know anything about that. But again, if you would like to email me, Mick, I will find out for you and perhaps send you some links to places where you can get the information on that.
Yeah, I've got a fair idea of it. I just didn't know whether it was out there to other people that you can actually do that. There's certain criterias and certain levels of owning your own house and things, but it's a way to get people into your club that aren't working, that you're over 55, not retired, not on the pension, the age pension, but are volunteers, and they might be working in your club as a volunteer, but they can actually get a few dollars for doing it.
Okay, well, I'll look into that because it's something I don't know about. It's changed. It's 3 years since I left managing a volunteer program, and part of that, work for the dole and mutual obligation was part of my job, but I've been a little bit out of the loop with it the last 3 years. But if you email me, I'll find out, or I'll put you in touch with the people who can help you.
Yeah, good on you. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome, Mick.
Okay, thank you. I think we might leave it there because we did end up starting a little bit late due to our technological issues that let us down a little bit. So thank you very much, Hazel, for a fabulous presentation. We will have the second session next Thursday night, the 22nd. which will focus on retaining volunteers. But before we finish, I'm just going to launch a quick poll that I would love you to just fill out the questions for me so that we can make sure that we're meeting your needs whenever we do these webinars. It'll only take you a couple of minutes. So thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday night at 7.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.